So now let's move on to loops. And what loops are, they're basically structures that allow us to iterate through various collections. And what that means is instead of writing code repetitiously over and over again, in some cases we can use loops to save us some time and write less lines of code because a lot of the information would be the same, or would be pretty similar, or even a lot of the logic would be similar. So that's the reason why we would use loops. So let me just kind of demonstrate you how that works. I'm going to go right back up here to the top, and in our main method here, I'm going to define another signature here, sorry. So we are going to call this just loops and close this out, and then we're going to come to the bottom here of loops, and we're going to, or rather of the prior method, and define a loops method like that. Okay, so I think the best way to demonstrate this is kind of working with various data types and kind of show you exactly how this would work. So let's see. Let's say, for example, we want to iterate from 0 to 5, and we just want to output the numbers to the console. We want to show each number outputted in repetition or in iteration. So to do that, there's something called a for loop, and we would write it like this. We say for. The next part is within the parentheses, we specify the data type, which we more than likely 9 times out of 10 be integer. And then we give it a temp variable or a temporary variable. This variable would serve as a counter that serves its purpose of sort of keeping track of the iteration within the loop. So we're going to call this int I is equal to 0 to be the starting value of 0. Then a semicolon. The next thing within this loop we're going to specify is the condition at which the loop should end. So we're going to say if I is less than 5, or actually, you know what, let's do if I is less than or equal to 5. And what we expect this loop to do now is we expect it to iterate from 0 to 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Lastly, as a condition here, we specify something called an increment operator. Now the increment operator is specified with a double plus sign, and what that is basically doing is taking the value of I on the first iteration. For example, in the first, I will be equal to 0, and it's incrementing that count by 1 on the next iteration. So then on the next iteration, I will equal 1 because because 0 plus 1 is equal to 1. Then on the following iteration, it will equal 2 because 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So if you want to increment, instead of saying I is equal to I plus 1, you can actually say I is equal to double plus or I double plus, and that would increment the value. On the other side of things, if you want to decrement, you could say I double minus, and that would reduce the count by 1. So let's go ahead and close that up here. And within this block, all we want to do is something simple. We want to console.writeLine the output of the number. And to do that, just to kind of make sure that we're outputting the correct thing, I'm going to put a string literal in here, and I'm going to say number is equal to, or not equal to, but number is of I. So we're just outputting the value of I in this case. So if I run this, it's taking a while. There we go. So we see that it's outputting 0 through 5. On each iteration of the loop will basically, what will happen is once it hits this for loop on line 180, is all it's going to do is check the condition. It will initialize the variable to 0. It will check if 0 is less than or equal to 5. And then on the next iteration of the loop, after the console.writeLine is outputted, it will increase the counter to 1. And then 2, then 3 subsequently. So that's basically how a loop works. A for loop specifically works in C#. Now, the good thing again is that this knowledge is transferable. You can actually use a similar structure in other programming languages. So again, you learning it here is applicable to many programming languages. Now, the next thing we have here is the while loop. And a while loop is generally used when you're not really sure about how long a loop should run, but you want to specify a condition that needs to be met for the loop to exit. So basically how that works, I'll give you a simple example here. Let's say if I define a counter variable, or let's just say int count is equal to 0. okay? So int count is equal to 0. And the reason why we want to specify this integer variable is we want to avoid a circumstance called infinite looping. And basically what that is when you have a while loop and you don't have a counter somewhat getting incremented or decremented within the while loop, it could be that that while loop will run infinitely. And when that happens, it can lead to a Stack Overflow exception in some programming languages or a memory leak. So generally what you want to do is you want to specify this count variable or a counter variable to avoid that circumstance from happening. And let me demonstrate. So next we're going to define our while loop. So we say while, and we're going to say while the count is less than 5. So something similar to above, but we're just going to say less instead of less than or equal to. So while this count is less than 5, let's just output here console.writeLine. What we're going to output is, let's just call this a string literal of while count, and we're just going to output here the count. And if I were to run this just like this, we're going to have the infinite loop scenario because we're not incrementing or decrementing 5. So in this case, we're not incrementing it so that this condition here, this count is less than 5, will ever evaluate to false. Because what needs to happen is this needs to evaluate to false in order for the program to exit this while loop. While this condition is true, it's going to continue to iterate and loop through this set of instructions. So what we generally want to do here is below this, we want to say count plus plus. So that way we increment this count as we go along, and eventually this count will hit 5. And once it does that, then this program will exit this while loop. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. So as you can see, now that we ran this, we don't see 0 to 1 million or any large number. We actually see 0 through 4. And the reason why is because the loop exited as soon as count equaled 5, because the statement evaluated to false in that case. So that's basically how you use a while loop. Again, we would use this instead of a for loop if we're not really sure in advance how long we want something to loop. We just want it to loop, and we may specify this count variable. You don't necessarily need to use the counter in this section here. You can actually use any other kind of like Boolean evaluation or Boolean variable here. You just got to make sure you have a counter set, and that somehow whatever you set, that needs to be sort of like included in this evaluation so that this will eventually exit the loop and avoid an infinite looping scenario. So the next type of loop we're going to cover here is the do while loop. And basically the difference between a do while and a while loop is that a do while loop is guaranteed to execute at least once, whereas a while loop does not have that guarantee that it will execute at all, especially if the evaluation of the statement is false. So in this case, let me just demonstrate. So let's say, for example, we'll specify a do while loop here, and it's written like this. We say do as a keyword, and then at the very end of it, we say while, and we'll use the same counter variable. We'll say if the count is less than 10. And don't forget to put a semicolon. This is actually one of the only loops that actually has a semicolon at the very end of the line. And if you don't do that, you'll get an error message. So make sure that's included. Now, what we want to do here, just before we write the code here within the loop, is we want to be able to reset the value of count to 0. So that way we can clearly see the output. All right. So what we want to do is let's just output console.writeLine. We're going to say do while count, and we're just going to output count. And let's not forget, guys, to also increment our count, because if we don't, we're going to have an infinite loop situation, and then it will be hard to continue running this code. So let's go ahead and run that and see what we get. So after running that, as you can see, sorry, my console skipped somewhere. As you can see here, we actually iterated from 0 to 9. As you can see here. So this is working as expected. Basically what happens is the iteration runs at least once, and then it basically evaluates thereafter this statement here. So it's guaranteed to run this console write line within the do, and then it does the evaluation of count is less than 10. And then what we're doing here is we're incrementing the count by 1 on every single loop, and then until it reaches 10, and once it reaches 10, it exits the loop. So that's a do while. To be honest with you, it's not used as commonly as other types of loops are, but it can come in helpful if you want to guarantee execution of a block of code at least once. So it could definitely come in very handy there. All right, so there's also some other types of loops that we can cover. I'm just trying to think if I should show you the for each. Yeah, you know what? I'll go ahead and show you. We may be jumping the gun here a little bit, but I'm going to show you guys the for each loop. So generally in the what the for each loop is basically a special loop type that iterates through a collection or an array. So an array and a collection are basically sort of, if you think of like a list of various values contained within a box, that you have like various values of the same data type, in usually in most cases. And that's basically what a collection is. It's a collection of values, usually of the same data type, that you can use to store multiple values within that list or within that collection. So arrays can be used in that fashion, as well as list sets. There are multiple types of collections that we'll go through shortly. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a simple array, since it's the simplest type of collection structure, if you will, just to demonstrate how a for each loop works. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify an int array. And we do that by first specifying the data type, which is int, and then we have this opening and closing bracket, square bracket. That signifies that this is going to be a collection of values or an array. So we're going to just create an array of numbers. So we give it the name numbers, and within this array, we can just open up some curly braces and specify the numbers. So 1, 2, 3, let's go all the way to 5. There you go. So now we have an array of 5 numbers within it. Now, one thing I want to point out here, we're going to cover arrays shortly, so I'm not going to go too much in detail, but basically every single position of an integer within this array is called an index. So basically the integer value of 1 is an index of 0. The integer value of 2 is an index of 1. So basically it's a zero a zero-based index, where the first position within an array, a list, or any other type of collection is basically the 0th position. It always starts with 0. So if you want to grab the value of 1, you would specify the index of 0. If you want to grab the last one, you would specify whatever the last position is minus 1. So in this case, we have 5 numbers. It will be the index of 4, not the index of 5. And you have to know that because you want to avoid error messages, especially index out of bounds exceptions. So let's go ahead and kind of demonstrate how this for each loop works. So to loop through and output all of these numbers, I'm going to type the keyword for each with no space in between. And then I'm going to specify here what our conditions are. So within the parentheses, what we want to do, and I'm just going to type this out and I'm going to walk you guys through it. We're going to say int number in numbers and curly braces. So basically what this says here, guys, is that for each iteration of the loop, we want to grab a single number from that index, the value from that index, which is an integer data type, and we want to grab that from the collection or array of numbers. And let me show you how this works with the output. So if we console.writeLine, and we're going to say number in array, for example, and we just output the number. If I can type it, number, yep. And let's run that. Let's see what we get. Cool. So now we see here that what the for each loop is doing is starting with the number 1, which is in the 0th index, or the index of 0, and it's outputting every single number until the very end of the list. Now, what is the huge selling point of using a for each rather than just using a simple for loop? Because you could do something like this as well, and I'll just show you guys the difference. You guys could have done something like this. You could say for int I is equal to 0, and then you can say if I is less than numbers dot length, And basically what this dot length property is this is a property that gets the length of an array, so how long the array is. So in this case, it would be 5, right? It would be the length of 5 because there are 5 items in the array. And then you do the I++, and then you could have said console.writeLine, and then you could say using standard, just to kind of differentiate here, for loop, and then say number. And in here, you could have said something like numbers of I. So basically what that's doing is on every iteration of the array, it's going to output using the current value of I, whatever is in that index. So on the first iteration, I is equal to 0, so it's going to get the number that's in the 0th index of the array. And just to make sure that that works, let's run that. And as you can see here, we are getting the same output as we got with the for each. So now, hopefully you guys can see the difference. Basically, looking at this, I would say the for each loop is a lot simpler to understand if I'm a new developer. And also, you don't have to really worry so much about index out of bounds exceptions. So for example, I'll show you guys an example. Let's say, for example, just really quickly, we know that we have 5 items in the array. Let's say if I try to grab the 10th item, or rather the 10th index in the array. If I were to run this now, you guys see that we have a bunch of gibberish here saying unhandled exception, and it's basically an index out of bounds exception. And the reason why is because we don't have 11 items in the array, because I'm grabbing the 10th, which is essentially the 11th item in the array. We don't have 11 items. That's the reason why we're having this issue. So I would say, honestly, it's much safer to use the for each loop instead of using the standard for loop when you're dealing with collections, because then it's all, I don't want to say you're guaranteed to not have problems, but you're a lot safer using a for each in this case when you're not sure how long a collection is or how many items are within the collection.